Good evening, and welcome back to Haunting the Fireside, a series about ghosts and other mystical things. In the spring of 1977, 4 teenagers claimed to have encountered a creature that looked as if it came from another planet or another world. Despite attempts by skeptics and believers to identify the mysterious creature, based on descriptions and sketches produced by the witnesses, no explanation thus far seems to have proved satisfactory. Tonight, we'll be discussing the case of the Dover Demon. Although it's located about 15 miles outside of Boston, Dover, Massachusetts, had always been a rural, yet affluent community. One historian described the town as having more horses than people. Where houses were absent, woods and grasslands stretched in every direction. By all appearances, nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen there. That is, until the night of April 21st, 1977. It was around 10:30 p.m. when 17-year-old Bill Bartlett was driving northbound on Dover's Farm Street, a long river-like road that has very few houses and is surrounded by fields and woods. On this particular evening, Bartlett was joined by his 2 friends, Andy Brody and Mike Mazzocca, who were chatting amongst themselves. While the sky was clear and no other cars were around, Bill was responsible enough to keep his eyes on the dark, empty road. He went on high alert when he detected movement off to the left side of the road. From a distance, and with the partial illumination of his car's headlights, he was able to make out a silhouette that he thought, at first, was a dog or cat crawling along the stone wall that ran parallel with the street. But as Bill drove on towards the figure, his car's headlights would reveal, for only a few seconds, a frightening image that would remain with him for the rest of his life. In the headlights, Bill saw that the figure, which turned to face the oncoming vehicle, had, in his words, 2 large, round, glassy, lidless eyes, shining brightly, like 2 orange marbles. They were embedded in a watermelon-shaped head set upon a slim neck, and was attached to a small, thin, hairless, rough-looking, peach-colored body. Extending from it were hands and feet that were disproportionately large. As it made its way along the wall, Bill noted that the creature appeared to be moving in such a way that it was unsure of itself. Even within such a short time, Bill judged the creature's height to be about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. When Bill sped up suddenly, Andy and Mike noticed that their friend was visibly shaken. Apparently, neither of them had been looking in the same direction as Bill had. Andy was in the passenger seat, and Mike was in the back seat. Both were most likely focused on the right side of the road. They asked him what was wrong, and Bill described the creature he had just seen. To his chagrin, the answer only spurred on their adolescent curiosity. Not content with simply hearing about it, Andy and Mike spurred Bill on to turn the car around so they could see the creature for themselves. Bill was reluctant to do this, of course, as he had no idea what that thing was, and therefore did not know what it was capable of doing. After moments of deliberation, Bill eventually caved in to Andy and Mike's energetic peer pressure. He pulled into a side street, turned around, and headed back to the spot where he had seen the creature. But to his relief, it was nowhere to be seen. As he slowed down, Andy and Mike rolled down their windows and shouted out into the night, coaxing the creature to show itself, which only intensified Bill's fear. But the creature did not reappear, and so Bill, tired and unnerved, dropped his friends off at their respective houses. Upon returning home, Bill's father saw that his son was agitated and asked what was bothering him. Bill told his father everything, and then went straight to his bedroom, where he proceeded to sketch an image of the creature from memory. Bill loved to draw in his spare time. He would state later in interviews that he had trained his mind to retain as many details as possible of whatever he saw. Natural landscapes, the faces of strangers, so that he could draw it from the image bank of his acquired photographic memory. His promising artistic talent even earned him a membership in the Copley Society, a guild for young and aspiring artists. So much for Bill Bartlett's account of an unknown creature prowling around in the area that night. His was not the only one. About 2.5 hours later, at around 12:30 a.m. on April 22nd, 15-year-old John Baxter was walking along Miller Hill Road, which connects with Farm Street not too far from where Bill and his friends turned around. John had just been spending time over his girlfriend's house, and was making his way home. Unlike earlier, the sky was now overcast, and the temperature had dropped slightly. In his travels, John spied a figure that was walking down the road towards him. Even though it was dark, and the distance too great to make out specific features, John judged by the figure's short frame that it was probably one of his friends, who happened to live in that neighborhood. Based on this assumption, John greeted the figure, saying, "MG, is that you?" The situation took an odd turn when the figure said nothing in response, but kept on walking towards him. When John and the figure got within approximately 25 feet of each other, the figure finally stopped in its tracks. John halted as well, and called out again, this time with uncertainty and unease. "Who is that?" To get a better look at the figure, John took a step forward. That's when the figure spun around and fled in the opposite direction. For some reason, John chased the thing into some nearby woods, where it ran down into a gully and partially hid itself behind a tree. Its feet appeared to be molded to a rock on the ground, and its long fingers wrapped around the tree trunk, as if it had trouble standing on its own. From the top of the slope, John was now able to see this thing for what it was. In his words, the creature's body resembled that of a monkey's, small and thin. He would describe its head as figure-8 shaped, and it had large, glowing eyes, which were staring right at him. This fact frightened John so much that, with a pounding heart, he backed away slowly until he was out of the woods. Once he got to the road, he walked briskly out to Farm Street, where a couple driving by saw him, afraid and alone, and offered to bring him home. Once he got into his house, he immediately went about sketching the creature that he saw in the woods. Less than a week later, the illustrations by Bill Bartlett and John Baxter were placed side by side to compare and contrast. The details were strikingly similar, although both boys claimed to have no prior knowledge of each other's encounter with the creature. The third and last sighting occurred at around midnight of April 22nd or April 23rd. 18-year-old Will Tainter was driving his 15-year-old girlfriend Abby Brabham to her home in Sherborne, a town located just west of Dover. They were somewhere on Springdale Avenue, which runs into Farm Street, when Abby claimed to have seen something crouched down on the left side of the road. She would later describe this something as a monkey-like creature with a large, oblong-shaped head on a small, hairless, tan or beige-colored body. It had no mouth, no nose, and no ears, but it had eyes, which, she claimed, were green. Despite this brief sighting, Abby Brabham was scared enough to demand that Will speed up to pass the thing as quickly as possible. Will, on the other hand, only caught a glimpse of the figure, and later asked Abby to describe to him what she had seen. After that night, this strange creature with no name, seen only by a few teenagers, seemingly vanished into thin air. As far as anyone knows, no other sightings have been recorded. Now that the accounts have been laid out, our next task is to examine and consider the details that have been given. We are led to ask, what is, or was, the Dover Demon? It is inevitable that, once a story of this caliber finds its way into the hands of the press, the original premise gets overshadowed by sensationalism. Most books that have been written about cryptids, or creatures that can't be identified by modern science, only scratch the surface of the Dover Demon story. With the advent of the internet as a medium of information in the 21st century, attempts have been made to debunk the mystery without first trying to understand it. Few researchers, believer and skeptic alike, seem to be honest enough to approach this case with a view to come to a fair and independent conclusion. The reality is that we can only work around the facts that have been placed before us, which, in this case, are the accounts of Bill Bartlett, John Baxter, and Abby Brabham, told in their own words. The acclaimed cryptozoologist and paranormal researcher Loren Coleman had been working in Needham, the next town over from Dover, around the time the sightings happened. While he was in the Dovey County store about a week later, he saw the clerk studying the sketches that were made by Bartlett and Baxter. Intrigued, Coleman opened a case file, which he titled Dover Demon, and began investigating the witnesses and their accounts. To ensure that the case was covered as widely and deeply as possible, Coleman enlisted the help of UFO investigators, as well as Walter Webb, head of the Boston Science Museum's Hayden Planetarium. Much of what is documented about this case, including the testimonies of Bill Bartlett, John Baxter, and Abby Brabham, as well as those who knew them, come from those investigations, the fruits of which can be found in his book, Mysterious America. Several aspects of this case are worth considering. One is that all 3 sightings took place exclusively at night. This would suggest that whatever the creature was, natural or supernatural, had nocturnal habits. Another is that all of the witnesses were teenagers, between the ages of 15 to 18. No adult living in the area reported anything out of the ordinary. In fact, Farm Street residents were interviewed, and none of them indicated that anything was amiss at the times of the encounters. For example, a woman named Alice Stewart, who lived on that road, stated that her dogs didn't bark or act up on either of the 2 nights. Nevertheless, in discussing his findings, Coleman points out that practically every adult, parents, teachers, and local police officers that he and his team interviewed had readily accepted the stories as legitimate. In the eyes of these adults, the witnesses were good kids and not prone to lie for attention or pull pranks. As Webb and Coleman indicate in Mysterious America, the only exception was a teacher who leveled some accusations against Bartlett. This teacher is quoted as describing Bartlett as a troubled, frustrated kid who cut classes, hung around the smoking lounge with John Baxter, and belonged to a clique that included Baxter. For reasons unknown, the individual wished to remain anonymous, and his or her motives for attacking Bartlett's character are likewise unknown. When Coleman and Webb approached Bartlett himself about the accusations, he denied some of them, but admitted that Baxter was one of his friends. Some other interesting details about the witnesses surfaced from the interviews conducted by Coleman and his team. According to his father, John Baxter was an avid science fiction fan, and even liked to write science fiction stories. While this is innocent in itself, we should keep this in mind when we discuss the theories as to the creature's identity. Another, perhaps less innocent detail is that Bartlett admitted that he had smoked some marijuana about an hour before he saw the creature, though he insisted that he was sober enough during the encounter. Could Bartlett have been affected by the drug, however so slightly, that he mistook some real, naturally existing animal for the Dover Demon? That depends on just how much marijuana he had smoked, and how much time it took to get out of his system. In his own words, Bill had only a few puffs. Coleman and Webb apparently did not think this was a game-changing factor, primarily because, while marijuana tends to impair judgment, it does not usually cause hallucinations. At least, not in very low doses. Also, this would not account for the Baxter and Brabham sightings, because neither of them had said anything about drinking or taking drugs. Then there is the discrepancy in the creature's eye color. Whereas Bill Bartlett claimed that the Dover demon's eyes were orange, Abby Brabham claimed that they were green. Even when she was made aware of that detail in Bill's account, she insisted on her own experience. But now 2 different eye colors have been reported. Could either Bill have misremembered what he saw, or could Abby have succumbed to the error of many eyewitnesses who, despite having an inaccurate memory, persist in the conviction that their testimony is correct? Seeing how Bill had a highly retentive memory, which enabled him to sufficiently recollect the creature's form and features to draw it out on paper, I would be inclined to think that Abby, and not he, was mistaken. Unless, however, there was a possibility that they were both right about the creature's eye color. We'll get to that later. The earliest natural explanation was proposed by UFO enthusiast Martin Kottmeyer. In an article he published in The Anomalist, Kottmeyer suggested that what the teenagers saw was a baby moose. For a time, this demon moose theory prevailed as the most likely incarnation of the Dover demon, as one could draw the similarities between a baby moose and how the demon has been described. An oversized head attached to a thin body, crawling or crouching on the ground, tan skin, which, when flashed with car headlights, could be mistaken for the short brown fur of a moose, and the absence of ears, which would be the undeveloped antlers. Unfortunately for Kottmeyer, this is where the similarities end. Coleman, and even some well-known skeptics like Joe Nickell, don't buy this hypothesis, which seems to have been officially dismissed, for many reasons. First of all, moose are uncommon in Massachusetts. They may be seen every now and then out in the central part of the state, and as far west as the Berkshires, but certainly not in the eastern, metropolitan side of Massachusetts. For a moose to wind up in Dover, Massachusetts, would mean that it had traveled around Boston and through its noisy, densely populated suburbs without being noticed by anyone else, or even showing up on the news. In his book on moose, Mark Raycroft writes that, by and large, the species tends to occupy the northern wilderness regions of the United States and Canada. Even though Dover is a historically rural town, it doesn't make sense that a single moose, let alone a baby one, would appear in the area and roam around on its own. In tandem with this point, most moose calves are born in mid-May, not in April, when the encounters took place. Also, baby moose prefer to spend most of their early development with the mother, since they haven't yet learned how to obtain their own food or to navigate their environment. Lastly, while the Dover demon had been spotted on all fours in the Bartlett and Brabham encounters, it was clearly able to run, walk, and stand on 2 legs when Baxter came into contact with it. As Coleman puts it, the notion that the demon was a moose is more outrageous than the possibility of a real Dover demon. Another theory that runs in the same vein is that the demon was really a foal, or a young horse. This sounds plausible, as it was said earlier that the town once had more horses than people. But if the teenagers really saw a baby horse, wouldn't they have known that's what it was? In a recent interview with WGBH, paranormal researcher Jeff Belanger raises this point about the absurdity of misidentifying something in an area that one has lived in long enough and has become accustomed to what is common and what is not. For instance, people who live in heavily wooded or mountainous regions are used to seeing deer, bears, and coyotes and don't usually mistake them for anything else. I think we can grant that, living in an area with a lot of horses, the witnesses in this case would have had the capability to determine that they had, indeed, seen a young horse. If they were frightened and intimidated by this creature, then it is more likely that it was something with which they were completely unfamiliar. At this point, it becomes clear that the name Dover Demon is something of a misnomer, for it isn't a demon at all, in the theological sense of that word. Rather, it looks like what most people would visualize when they think of a typical alien from outer space. This figures into the cultural angles of this case. You will recall that the sightings took place in 1977. Many people, even if they were not alive at the time, might recognize that that was the year in which two major science fiction movies were released: the first installment of the Star Wars franchise, and Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Both films present a heavy, extraterrestrial presence in which human characters live with, fight against, and are abducted by alien-like beings. The question here is, were the witnesses' imaginations stirred by the cultural influences that surrounded them? Although the films went into theaters months after the Dover Demon sightings occurred, it is still possible that the teenagers saw advertisements wherever they went. We could combine these factors with Bill Bartlett's love of drawing and John Baxter's knack for reading and writing science fiction stories. Maybe there never was a Dover Demon to begin with. After all, we have nothing in the way of physical evidence of the alleged creature. We have only descriptions and drawings, which tally to nothing more than circumstantial evidence. If we were to adopt this theory, we would get either the perfect recipe for a hoax that had been perpetrated by a pair of clever and creative youths, or otherwise, a sincere but misguided account that was shaped by movies, television, and the books of Asimov, Bradbury, and Lovecraft. Seeing that this was a small group, a little game such as this would have been easy to orchestrate. All the witnesses had to do was claim a lack of foreknowledge of each other's encounter. Furthermore, it is difficult to believe that in such a small town as Dover, none of the witnesses were entirely unknown to one another. As Coleman indicates in Mysterious America, Bartlett told his good friend Will Tainter about his own encounter on April 22nd, the day after his own sighting of the creature. As we know, Tainter and Brabham happened to see something on the road while they were out driving later that night. Moreover, in light of some accusations about his character that had been made by the anonymous teacher, Bartlett admitted that he and Baxter were friends. So, with these elements on the table, so to speak, it is possible that most or all of the witnesses could have collaborated on this narrative. This would only be contradicted by Bartlett, who stated himself that he was not particularly interested in science fiction. The most recent natural explanation has been put forward by Joe Nickell. I think it is the most formidable theory that has been advanced so far. Writing for the skeptical Inquirer, Nickell contested that the Dover Demon was really a snowy owl. His reasoning is that, like the demon, the snowy owl appears to be earless because of the smooth, round head, and without a nose or mouth because of the beak. Both of these creatures, the demon and the owl, have yellowy orangey eyes that can glow when light is shone upon them, and may reflect slightly different pigments or shades, depending on the angle and the color of the light. This could help to explain the orange that prevailed in Bartlett's account, and the green, which is chromatically close to yellow, in Brabham's. Snowy owls are also larger than most other owls, and would come close to matching the demon's height at around 3.5 feet tall. Snowy owls are observed to be silent outside of their breeding season, which would explain why the figure on the road made no reply when John Baxter called out to it. Not that it would say anything anyway, seeing how it's a non-human animal. On this point, Nickell suggested that the owl, in this case, was employing a tactic called the Crippled Bird Act. According to Fred Alsop in his book on North American birds, some species, such as the snowy owl, pretend to be injured and tempt a predator to approach it, only to run away, in order to lure the predator from the bird's nest. This is similar to how the demon got within roughly 25 feet of Baxter, but kept itself at a distance, only to scamper away when Baxter ran after it. Now, as we have seen with Kottmeyer's failed theory, just because an explanation appears to be logical or natural, relative to a paranormal explanation, doesn't mean that is necessarily correct or applicable to the case at hand. As such, we should think about Nickell's snowy owl-Dover demon connection a little more critically. Snowy owls are almost entirely white-feathered. Because of this, Nickell has raised the point that a white surface naturally takes on the color of whatever light is shown onto it. It would follow, then, that the peach-colored skin, or a sort of dusky, light brownish orange, of the Dover demon was most likely due to the white feathers adopting the orange or yellow pigmentation from the car's headlights. Regarding their habits and habitation, snowy owls are active both in daylight and in darkness. Their favorite places tend to be in grasslands, marshlands, and beaches, where they like to either stand flat on the ground or to perch on lampposts, rocks, dunes, hay bales, and buildings. They breed in the Arctic tundra, but outside of the breeding season, they spend most of their time in Canada, parts of the northern United States, Scandinavia, and Russia. Like the moose, it is rare for a snowy owl to be seen anywhere south of the northernmost states in the U.S. However, it can and does happen. To illustrate the owl's variable flight plan, Nickell cites a news item about a snowy owl that appeared near Los Angeles, California, in January of 2023. According to CNN, no one knew exactly how this snowy owl came to rest on the roof of someone's house. All the same, bird experts proposed a few theories, such as that it might have gotten lost from its brood because it wasn't used to migrating, especially if it was young, or that it could have come in on some cargo ship that recently entered port. In addition, snowy owls have been spotted on multiple Connecticut beaches in December of 2024. But as interesting as these might be, it doesn't solidify the case that a snowy owl had been spotted by 4 teenagers in Dover, Massachusetts in April of 1977. The 2 recent snowy owl sightings happened in the winter, whereas the sightings that we are discussing took place in the spring. We would have to assume that the Dover demon was really a snowy owl to begin with, but again, that would mean assuming the existence of a Dover demon in the first place. That is, if the whole story had not been purely imagined by Bill Bartlett and friends. I have some reservations that keep me from fully accepting Nickell's theory. One of them is that if birds like the snowy owl pull the crippled bird act when they are trying to lure a predator away from a nest, and if Baxter was the victim of this tactic, where was the nest that the snowy owl demon had been protecting? I would think that if any kind of bird was migrating to a given area for any length of time, it would have made a nest somewhere. This also would have increased the likelihood of more people seeing the owl and its progeny at some point on either of the two nights. But if it had no nest nearby, then the snowy owl had no reason for doing this. Another aspect of this theory involves a specific question about snowy owl habits. My qualm is that when Baxter followed the creature into the woods, and the creature stood on a rock while it hid behind a tree, Baxter told Coleman and his team that the creature wrapped its fingers around the tree trunk to support its supposed instability. Now, why would a snowy owl do this? Birds, and specifically snowy owls, are by nature accustomed to perching on narrow objects like a pole or sloped surfaces like a rock. There are plenty of photographs and books and on the internet that show these birds standing calmly, with 2 feet, on nearly every kind of surface, from the edges of logs to fences. Also, would a bird really reach out with its talons to hold on to something to help it stand? We as humans have the intelligence, or the instinct, to do this with our hands when we are unstable, but I just don't know if the same can be said of other animal species. Last on this point, if this was a snowy owl, would it not have shed at least some feathers as it crawled on the stone wall, or ran away from Baxter? Now that would have been damning physical evidence, but again, nothing of the sort had been presented. A considerable number of years has passed since 4 teenagers claimed to have encountered an unknown creature in the spring of 1977. A creature that, by its description, seemed to defy all natural explanation. Yet, nothing that remotely resembles the alien-like creature has been sighted since. In his 2013 book, Monsters of Massachusetts, Coleman discusses how the passage of time has affected the image of the Dover demon. According to him, the witnesses, Bill Bartlett, John Baxter, and Abby Brabham, are all by now grown adults, leading relatively normal lives with families of their own. While they have retold parts of their individual accounts to various news sources, they seem to have moved on from those 2 April nights. But despite their wishes to distance themselves from the Dover demon that they have come to be associated with, the story itself has continued to thrive in the public consciousness. It has aroused curiosity in some and affirmed skepticism in others. Paranormal enthusiasts still pay visits to Dover, Massachusetts, in search of the demon, only to be caught trespassing by police. In October 2006, Mark Sullivan wrote a retrospective piece about the Dover demon, which included some comments from the then 46-year-old William Bill Bartlett, a working artist and resident of Needham, Massachusetts, He maintained that he saw what he saw, but he just doesn't know what it was. He expresses his embarrassment at having his name being forever welded with the famous sketch of the Dover Demon. He is also bothered that people think he made it all up. In response, Bartlett flatly says, "Sometimes I wish I had." To be fair to Bartlett and his fellow witnesses, if they are being truthful, it is distressing to be in the position of having to describe an anomalous experience to others, but find that you are unable to do so because you do not fully comprehend it yourself. Today, the Dover Demon, the concept at least, enjoys international fame in the form of merchandise and art. A Japanese toy company apparently manufactures figurines that look like the creature. Animal Planet's Lost Tapes, a documentary-style show that features dramatized encounters with paranormal creatures, aired an episode based on the Dover Demon in 2009. In 2015, author Hunter Shea published a novel about it. And the Dover Historical Society now sells t-shirts that portray the creature, according to a 2021 article from Metro West Daily News. So, what is, or was, the Dover Demon? Was it a hoax? Was it a misidentification of something natural? Or was it a real-life cryptid? If so, where did it come from, and where did it go? Why hasn't it reappeared in Dover, or appeared anywhere else in the world for that matter, in 4 decades and counting? Because of the singular quality of this case, we are constrained to mere speculation about what it could have or could not have been. This leads us to consider the next question, perhaps the most important one for serious minds. Why should we be so interested in the Dover Demon? We are unable to study it beyond the eyewitness accounts and the investigation that Coleman and his team had conducted. It is not as if we can observe the creature with our own eyes, to see for ourselves what it really looked like. It becomes, then, an enduring mystery that can never satisfy the believing mind, and at the same time, can never be properly debunked by the skeptic. We have reached the end of another episode of the Book Service Podcast. A list of sources will be available in the video description for those of you who wish to verify the information and to do your own research on the subject. As always, thanks for listening, and keep on reading.